The knock at the door. The winter storm roared outside like an angry beast, its icy breath rattling the windows of the old house perched on the edge of town. The wind howled through the trees, bending their skeletal branches beneath the weight of the relentless snowfall. Inside, Thomas Calloway sat in his worn leather armchair, staring into the crackling fire, the flickering flames casting restless shadows on the walls. His house was silent, just as it had been for the last 10 years. The only sound besides the storm outside was the occasional creak of the old wooden beams shifting under the weight of time. It should have been peaceful. Instead, the quiet had become his prison. He reached for the glass of whiskey on the side table, his fingers tightening around the cool glass, but before he could take a sip, a sound cut through the howling wind. A knock. At first, he thought it was just the wind battering against the door, but then it came again, harder, more urgent. He frowned, setting the glass down. No one came to his house, especially not in weather like this. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and most folks in town had long since given up trying to pull them back into the world. He debated ignoring it, letting whoever it was get the message and leave. But something about the knock, that desperate, almost pleading rhythm, gnawed at him. With a sigh, he pushed himself up from the chair, his joints aching in protest. He grabbed the thick wool cardigan draped over the back of the couch and pulled it on before making his way to the door. Another knock. Weaker this time. Thomas hesitated for a second, his fingers hovering over the old brass handle, before finally pulling it open. The wind nearly tore the door from his grip, sending a flurry of snow inside. But it wasn't the wind that stole the breath from his lungs. Two tiny figures stood on his porch, trembling in the cold. Two little girls, no older than 5, stood barefoot in the swirling snow. Their nightgowns were soaked through, clinging to their small frames. Their dark curls were dusted with frost, and their lips were tinged blue. The taller of the two clung to the smaller girl, her tiny arms wrapped around her sister's shivering shoulders in a feeble attempt to keep her warm. The smaller girl's legs gave out, and she crumpled onto the snow-covered porch. Without thinking, Thomas lunged forward, scooping the unconscious child into his arms. The taller girl let out a small, strangled cry, her tiny hand clutching at his sleeve, as if afraid he would take her sister away. "Come on inside," he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. The girl hesitated for a moment before nodding and following him inside. The warmth of the house hit them instantly. Thomas kicked the door shut with his foot, sealing out the storm. He hurried to the couch, carefully laying the unconscious child down. Her skin was ice cold, her breaths shallow and uneven. He turned to the other girl, who was standing a few feet away, still clutching the wet fabric of her nightgown. She was shivering so violently, he thought she might collapse as well. "Come here," he said gently, reaching for the thick wool blanket draped over the back of the chair. The girl hesitated before taking a cautious step forward. He wrapped the heavy blanket around her trembling form, tucking the edges beneath her small hands. "What happened?" he asked, crouching in front of her. "Where did you come from?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him with wide, dark eyes filled with something far beyond her years. Fear. She had the look of someone who had seen too much, too soon. Thomas turned back to the unconscious child and pressed his palm against her forehead. She was so cold. Too cold. He needed to act fast. Grabbing another blanket, he wrapped her up tightly, then leaned down and gently rubbed her hands between his, trying to coax warmth back into them. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he murmured. "Don't you give up now." The little girl made a small sound, a weak whimper, but didn't open her eyes. The other twin took a hesitant step closer. "Lily," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Thomas looked up at her. "Is that her name? Lily?" The girl nodded. "And what's your name?" he asked gently. A pause. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear it, "Emma." Thomas swallowed hard. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to tell me what happened. Where's your mother? Your father?" Emma's lips trembled, but she didn't say anything. Thomas exhaled, pressing a hand against his forehead. He needed to focus. The kids needed dry clothes, warm drinks, and most of all, reassurance that they were safe. "I'll be right back," he told Emma. "I need to get some clothes for you both." She watched him carefully but didn't move as he hurried upstairs. In the back of his closet, he found an old box of clothes he hadn't touched in years. Small sweaters, soft pajamas. They had belonged to someone once, someone he had loved more than life itself. His hands trembled as he pulled out 2 small sweaters, running his fingers over the fabric. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A little boy laughing, chasing snowflakes in the front yard. A boy who never got to grow up. Thomas clenched his jaw and forced the thought away. He didn't have time for ghosts tonight. When he came back downstairs, Emma hadn't moved from the spot where he left her. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her tiny fingers peeking from beneath the blanket. She flinched slightly when he approached, but didn't pull away as he knelt beside her. "These are for you," he said, holding out the sweater. "They'll keep you warm." She stared at them for a long moment before finally, hesitantly, reaching out and taking them. As Emma changed into the dry clothes, Thomas focused on Lily. She was still unconscious, her breaths shallow, but her skin was starting to regain some warmth. He gently brushed damp curls from her face. "You're safe now, sweetheart," he murmured. He glanced back at Emma, who had curled up in the oversized sweater, watching him carefully. "You're safe too," he added. The fire crackled softly, filling the house with warmth. For the first time in 10 years, the house didn't feel empty anymore. But deep in Thomas's chest, something cold curled around his heart. Because when he had seen Lily's face in the firelight, seen her delicate features, her tiny upturned nose, the shape of her lips, something inside him had shattered. Because he had seen that face before. A face that belonged to someone he had lost decades ago. A face that should have been impossible. Who were they? And how had they ended up here, on his doorstep, in the middle of a blizzard? And what secret did they hold that would change everything? The ghosts of the past. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth had begun to chase away the bitter chill that clung to the tiny girls, but Thomas Calloway's insides remained frozen. Lily lay unconscious on the couch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her breaths shallow but steadier now. Emma sat on the floor nearby, bundled in one of his old sweaters, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. She wasn't shivering anymore, but she was still silent, her dark eyes tracking his every move. Thomas knew that kind of silence. He had seen it before. It was the kind that came from fear so deep it took root in the bones. He ran a rough hand through his graying hair, exhaling. Who were these children? And why did Lily's face, her delicate features, the shape of her nose, the tiny mole beneath her left eye, haunt him like a ghost from another life? His heart pounded as he sat in the armchair across from them, staring into the fire. He needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But then Lily stirred. A faint whimper escaped her lips as her eyelashes fluttered. Emma was on her feet in an instant, rushing to the couch, her small hands grasping her sister's. "Lily," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Thomas leaned forward, watching as Lily's eyes blinked open. At first, they were unfocused, hazy from exhaustion, but then she saw him. And for a single moment, there was nothing but terror in her small, delicate face. Lily let out a strangled gasp, jerking upright so fast she nearly tumbled off the couch. Her tiny hands clutched at Emma, her wide brown eyes darting around the room, like a caged animal searching for an escape. Thomas raised his hands, palms up, a peace offering. "Hey now, sweetheart, it's all right," he said softly, as if trying to calm a skittish colt. "You're safe here." Lily didn't seem to hear him. Her breathing was fast, uneven. Emma clutched her hand, squeezing it 3 times in a silent message, her expression unreadable. Then Lily did something Thomas wasn't expecting. She reached for the locket around her neck. It was small, gold and delicate, glinting in the firelight. She clutched it tightly, knuckles turning white. A locket. Thomas swallowed hard. "Where did you get that, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice steady, though his insides were trembling. Lily's lips parted, but no sound came out. She glanced at Emma, who subtly shook her head, their silent communication eerily precise. Thomas's gaze locked onto the locket. He had seen one just like it before, a lifetime ago. He didn't push them, not yet. He didn't want to scare them more than they already were. Instead, he stood up. "You girls need something warm in your bellies." Neither of them moved. "Hot cocoa," he added. "I make it the best way. Extra marshmallows." That got a flicker of reaction. Lily blinked. Emma's fingers twitched slightly. Progress. Thomas moved to the kitchen, leaving them alone, but listening carefully. He worked quickly, heating milk on the stove, mixing in cocoa, and piling marshmallows into the 2 chipped mugs he had pulled from the cupboard. His hand shook slightly as he poured, his mind still spinning. By the time he turned back, Lily was sitting up properly, still clinging to Emma's hand, but the panic had dulled to wary exhaustion. Thomas placed the mugs on the coffee table in front of them. Stepping back, Lily hesitated. Emma eyed the drinks suspiciously, then glanced at her sister. It was another silent conversation, one that seemed to carry weight beyond their years. Finally, Lily reached out with trembling hands, pulling the warm mug toward her chest. She inhaled the steam. And for the first time, her tiny shoulders relaxed. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. "There," he said, sitting back down. "That's better, isn't it?" Lily took a cautious sip. Emma, however, remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. He had to gain their trust, and that meant answers. The ghost of someone long gone. The locket. That small golden thing that Lily had clutched so desperately. It was identical to one he had given someone a long, long time ago. His mind drifted back, against his will, to a memory he had buried beneath a decade of solitude. A little girl's laugh. Soft hands reaching for him. The scent of baby powder and wildflowers. And then, the accident. The phone call that had shattered his world. The desperate drive to the hospital. The beeping machines, the 2 bright lights, the doctors shaking their heads. His daughter gone. Her unborn child gone. Gone. Or had they been? Thomas gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. It was impossible, wasn't it? He looked at the twins again, the shape of their noses, their dark curls, the locket. No, it couldn't be. He needed answers. He took a slow breath. "Emma," he said carefully, "do you know where your mom is?" Emma's fingers tightened around her mug. She didn't answer. "What about your dad?" Silence. Then Lily spoke. Her voice was small, like a whisper lost in the wind. "Mama told us to run." Thomas's stomach clenched. Run from who? Lily pressed her lips together, looking down at her cocoa. Emma shot her a sharp look. Lily's lower lip wobbled. He was coming. "Who, sweetheart?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the ice creeping into his veins. Lily didn't answer, but Emma did. Her voice was quiet, flat. "The bad man." Thomas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. His instincts, long buried beneath years of grief and loneliness, flared to life. Someone had been after these girls, someone dangerous. And their mother, whoever she was, had left them in the middle of a snowstorm. Thomas sat back, gripping his thighs, his mind racing. They needed more than just shelter. They needed protection. He had spent the last 10 years drowning in grief, telling himself he had nothing left to give. But looking at these girls, something inside him stirred. Something he thought had died along with his daughter. Purpose. He didn't know who these girls were. Not yet. But he was going to find out. And whoever had hurt them, whoever had left them out there to freeze, would regret it. Secrets buried in snow. The fire in the hearth had burned low, glowing embers casting an eerie flickering light across the wooden floorboards. The house, once filled only with silence, now held the quiet hum of breath, soft, cautious, and uneven. Thomas sat in his armchair, staring at the two tiny figures curled up on his couch, wrapped tightly in the blankets he had given them. The cocoa cups sat mostly untouched on the table, steam long since faded. He hadn't slept. Instead, he had sat awake, watching over the twins, his mind unraveling the web of questions wrapped around them. Who were they? Who was the bad man they had run from? And more importantly, why did they look so much like someone he had lost a long time ago? Lily had drifted into an exhausted sleep first, her small fingers still curled around the golden locket at her neck. Emma had taken longer. She had fought against the pull of sleep, her dark eyes staying locked on Thomas for as long as she could hold them open. It was a test. She was watching him, measuring his actions, trying to decide if she could trust him. Eventually, exhaustion had won, and she had slumped against her sister, still gripping her tiny wrist as if to anchor her in place. Now, in the dim firelight, Thomas finally let out a slow breath. He needed answers, and there was only one place to start. The name he hadn't spoken in years. He reached for the blanket draped over the armrest, pulling it over himself before standing. His joints ached, stiff from years of disuse. Moving quietly, he crossed the room and crouched beside the couch. Lily murmured something in her sleep, her brow twitching, but she didn't wake. His gaze landed on the locket. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and brushed his fingers over the delicate gold. He had given a locket just like this to someone a lifetime ago. Maggie, his daughter, his beautiful, stubborn, reckless daughter. The last time he had seen her, she had been laughing, sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing a hand over her round belly, rolling her eyes at his concern. "Dad, seriously, stop worrying. I'm not some delicate flower." But she had been. And she had been taken from him far too soon. Or at least, that's what he had been told. His fingers trembled as he gently lifted the locket's clasp. It clicked open with a soft metallic snap, revealing what lay inside. A picture. 2 pictures. One side held a faded, grainy photograph of 2 tiny babies swaddled in identical blankets, nestled together in a hospital bassinet. The other, Thomas's breath hitched. It was Maggie. His Maggie. Smiling, alive, holding 2 babies in her arms. Thomas's head spun. Impossible. The hospital had told him that neither Maggie nor the baby had survived. Had they lied? Had someone, taken his family from him? His hands clenched into fists as he stood, jaw tight, breath shallow. Someone had kept the truth from him for years, and he was going to find out who. A visitor in the snow. Before he could process the storm of emotions crashing through him, a sound cut through the quiet. A car. The low hum of an engine, growing louder, approaching his house. Thomas stiffened. He turned to the window just in time to see a pair of headlights sweep across the front yard, cutting through the early morning fog that clung to the snow-covered ground. A vehicle. A black SUV, tires crunching over the ice as it rolled to a stop just beyond his porch. A bad feeling settled in his gut. Emma stirred, blinking awake, her body going stiff the second she heard the car. Her breathing quickened. Lily whimpered in her sleep, shifting closer to her sister. Emma's small fingers clenched into the blanket. Thomas could see it in her eyes, the sheer terror. He didn't hesitate. Moving quickly, he grabbed the poker from the fireplace, its iron tip still warm from the dying embers. He didn't care if it was paranoia. His gut was screaming at him. Something was wrong. The SUV door opened. A figure stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat, a hood pulled up against the cold. They stood there for a moment, unmoving, watching. Thomas's grip tightened on the iron poker. And then, a knock. Slow, deliberate. Emma's breath hitched. Lily stirred. Thomas exhaled through his nose, schooling his expression into something unreadable as he stepped toward the door. The knock came again. 3 times. Sharp, loud, firm. Thomas didn't ask who it was. Instead, he moved to the window, careful not to be seen, and peered out through the frost-covered glass. The man standing on his porch was unfamiliar. He had the air of someone used to getting what he wanted. His stance was rigid, his shoulders squared, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. But it was his eyes that put Thomas on edge. Cold, calculated. The kind of eyes that had seen too much, done too much. Thomas inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm as he stepped back toward the door. "Who is it?" he called out. Silence. Then, "I'm looking for something that belongs to me." Thomas's blood ran cold. His grip on the poker tightened. Behind him, Emma's tiny breath hitched. The man's voice was smooth, practiced. Not friendly, not angry. Just certain. Certain that he would get what he came for. Thomas's pulse pounded. Over his shoulder, he stole a glance at Emma. Her small fingers clutched the blanket so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He turned back to the door. "You've got the wrong house," Thomas said, keeping his voice even. A pause. And then, "I don't think I do." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slow and deliberate, the man lifted his hand and placed something against the windowpane. A picture. Thomas felt his stomach drop. It was a photograph. A grainy black and white security camera still, of Emma and Lily, huddled together, barefoot, running through the snow. "Let's not make this difficult, Mr. Calloway," the man said. Thomas felt something dark settle inside him. Something heavy. Something dangerous. Who was this man? And what had Emma and Lily run from? His grip on the iron poker tightened. "Leave," Thomas said, his voice low, deadly. A slow smirk spread across the man's lips. "That's not up to you." The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. A battle against the darkness. The world outside was still buried in snow, a vast, endless white stretching beyond the dim glow of the porch light. But the chill that settled in Thomas Calloway's bones had nothing to do with the cold. The man on the porch hadn't moved. He stood there, tall and motionless, one hand still pressing the grainy photograph of the twins against the glass. Thomas could hear the quiet, steady rhythm of his own breathing. He could hear the crackling of the dying fire behind him, and he could hear the small, frightened breaths of the little girl standing just a few feet away. Emma. She was trembling. Her tiny hands were gripping the fabric of the oversized sweater he had given her, her knuckles white. He didn't know what this man wanted, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't someone who knocked on doors asking for favors. This was someone who took what they wanted. And that meant one thing: he wasn't getting through this door. Thomas inhaled slowly, steadying himself. His grip on the iron fireplace poker tightened, the weight of it grounding him. He had been a soldier once. A younger man, a different man. But he still remembered what it felt like to stand at the edge of something dangerous, something that could not be avoided. Something like this. "Leave." He spoke the word evenly, letting it settle into the silence. The man outside didn't flinch, didn't move. A long pause stretched between them. Then, a slow, deliberate chuckle. It was soft at first, almost amused. Then it sharpened, darkened. "You have no idea what you're involved in, old man." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man tapped a single knuckle against the doorframe. Once. Twice. 3 times. A quiet warning. Then he stepped back. Thomas watched as he walked down the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. The SUV's headlights flared to life, cutting through the darkness, illuminating the man's silhouette for a moment before the door slammed shut behind him. Then the vehicle rolled away, disappearing into the night. But Thomas didn't move. He stood there, staring after it, every muscle in his body wound tight. Because he knew this wasn't over. A past that refused to stay buried. Emma was still standing near the couch, her small body rigid, her breath shallow. Lily was curled beneath the thick wool blankets, still asleep, blissfully unaware. Thomas turned, his expression softening as he crouched in front of Emma. "Sweetheart," he murmured, keeping his voice steady, calm. "Who was that man?" Emma didn't answer. But she didn't have to. The way her eyes darted toward the door, the way her fingers trembled against the hem of her sweater. She knew him. Knew him and feared him. And that was all Thomas needed to know. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. "All right," he said quietly. "Okay." This changed everything. Whoever this man was, he wasn't some concerned family member looking for lost children. He was dangerous. And that meant Emma and Lily weren't just lost. They were running from something. Something deadly. And that made them his responsibility now. Thomas sat back on his heels. "We're gonna figure this out," he told Emma. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe." Emma's lips pressed into a tight line. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. It was the tiniest sliver of trust, but it was enough. A night of decisions. Thomas didn't sleep. Instead, he moved through the house, checking the locks on every door, every window. It had been years since he had felt the need to be this cautious, this prepared. But his gut told him the man in the SUV would be back. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. And when that time came, Thomas wasn't going to be caught off guard. He grabbed his old hunting rifle from the locked cabinet in the basement, checked the barrel, made sure it was loaded. Then, as quietly as he could, he made his way back upstairs. The house was silent. The fire had burned low, leaving only soft, glowing embers. The twins were still curled on the couch, wrapped in the heavy blankets. For the first time, Emma wasn't lying stiff, wide-eyed, waiting for something bad to happen. She had fallen asleep, her small body curled protectively around her sister. Thomas leaned against the doorway, watching them for a long moment. They were so small, so fragile. But despite that, despite everything they had clearly been through, they were still fighting, still surviving. And he wasn't going to let them do it alone anymore. Not while he was still breathing. The truth in a photograph. Morning came slowly. Gray light seeped through the frost-covered windows, chasing away the shadows. The girls were still asleep when Thomas sat down at the kitchen table, spreading the photograph out in front of him. The security footage. A black and white image of Emma and Lily, barefoot, running through the snow. Something about it wasn't sitting right with him. The angle was strange. The graininess suggested it had been taken from an old, low-quality security system. And the timestamp in the corner. His breath caught. 3 nights ago. Just outside of town. They had been running for days. Alone. In this storm. Thomas clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the paper. His eyes drifted back to the photograph. And then he saw it. A second shadow in the corner of the frame. A third figure. Someone else had been there that night. Someone watching them. Hunting them. A plan forming. Thomas set the photograph down, his heart pounding. The girls had come to him for a reason. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was something else. But it didn't matter. Because now they were his to protect. And whoever that man was, whoever had been hunting them, he had just made a very big mistake. Thomas Calloway wasn't some frail old man who would back down. He was a soldier once. And he knew how to fight a war. The storm outside might have been settling. But inside Thomas's chest, a new storm had begun to rise. A storm that would destroy anyone who dared to take these girls from him. The storm that would not end. The kitchen was quiet, save for the faint hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Thomas's feet. The photograph lay in front of him, its grainy black and white image seared into his mind. Emma and Lily, running, barefoot, alone, and the shadow of a third figure lurking just out of sight. His hands curled into fists as he stared at it. Whoever had been after them was still out there. And now he knew where they were. Thomas pushed away from the table, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood. He moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to glance outside. Snow stretched out in every direction, untouched and pristine. But that meant nothing. Someone had already found them once. They would find them again. He had spent the last decade drowning in grief, shutting out the world, letting himself grow old and tired. But now he had something to fight for. And he would burn this whole damn town to the ground before he let anyone take these girls away from him. A silent guardian. A sound behind him made him turn. Emma was awake. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, her small body wrapped in the oversized sweater he had given her, her bare feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. Her dark eyes flicked to the photograph on the table, then to him, then back again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Emma stepped forward. She climbed up onto the chair across from him, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the table. She wasn't shaking anymore. She wasn't crying. She was staring at the photograph. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but firm. "We can't go back." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "Back where, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time, he saw something there besides fear. Determination. A hospital. Thomas's chest tightened. "The hospital," he repeated. "Why? What happened there?" Emma swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the sleeve of her sweater. "Mama said we had to run. She said he was coming. The bad man. The one in the black coat." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "She left us there. She said she'd come back." Her little chin wobbled, but she clenched her teeth, fighting back the tears that wanted to spill over. "But she didn't." Thomas's jaw tightened. "She left you?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded. Lily, still asleep on the couch, let out a small whimper in her sleep, curling into the blankets. Emma glanced back at her sister, then turned back to Thomas. "She said it was the only way to keep us safe." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't know much about their mother. Didn't know if she was a good person, a bad person, or just someone trying to survive. But one thing was clear: whatever she had been running from, it had found them. And now it had found him too. A knock at the window. A sharp sound made Thomas whip around. A knock. Not at the door. At the window. His stomach dropped. Emma went rigid. Thomas moved faster than he thought possible, stepping between her and the window, his hand tightening around the fireplace poker still sitting on the counter. He reached for the curtain. Then he saw it. A handprint, pressed against the frosted glass. A large, smudged handprint. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been standing at the window. Thomas's breath came slow and steady. He didn't whip the curtain back, didn't throw open the door. Instead, he moved quietly, carefully, toward the front of the house. The girls were still in the kitchen. They were safe. For now. But Thomas had lived long enough to know that safety was a temporary thing. He reached the front door, fingers flexing around the iron poker. He inhaled once, steadying himself, and yanked it open. Nothing. No one. The snow in the yard was undisturbed. But the feeling lingered. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. And whoever it was, they were patient. They were waiting. A plan takes shape. Thomas shut the door, locking it. Then he turned back toward Emma, who was still sitting at the table, staring at him with those quiet, knowing eyes. She didn't ask what he had seen. Didn't ask why his hands were shaking just a little. She already knew. They both did. Thomas exhaled. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We need a plan." Emma's lips parted slightly, surprised by the inclusion. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "You said you ran from the hospital," he said. "That means someone saw you. Someone might still be looking for you." Emma nodded slowly. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "If that man in the black coat comes back, I need to know everything about him. What he looks like. What he said. Anything you remember." Emma hesitated. Then slowly she pulled something out of her sweater pocket. Something small. Something folded. She placed it on the table between them. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he reached for it. It was an old, crumpled piece of paper. A photograph. The edges were worn, as if it had been held too many times. He smoothed it out on the table. His heart nearly stopped. It was him. The man from the porch. Dark eyes. Cold smile. Black coat. And beneath the photograph, scrawled in rushed, uneven handwriting, "Do note to Royustim." Thomas exhaled, his pulse roaring in his ears. He looked up at Emma. She was watching him. Waiting. Hoping. Thomas clenched his jaw. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice steady. "I don't plan to." The fight was coming. The storm outside had settled, but the one inside Thomas Calloway's chest had only just begun. He was an old man, tired, grieving, but he wasn't weak, and he sure as hell wasn't afraid of a man in a black coat. He had spent 10 years waiting for something to give his life purpose again, and now he had it. He stood, crossing the kitchen, unlocking the old wooden cabinet against the wall. Inside sat his rifle, cleaned, loaded, ready. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even started. And whoever that man was, whoever had left 2 little girls barefoot in the snow, he was about to regret ever coming to Thomas Calloway's door. The web of lies unraveled. The air inside Thomas Calloway's home felt heavy, thick with anticipation. The sun, weak and pale through the frosted windows, had barely touched the edges of the sky when the front door creaked open again. Thomas stood at the window, peering out into the yard, his rifle tucked firmly under his arm. His heart was steady, but his mind raced. The world outside might be still, but the storm inside him was far from over. Emma sat on the couch, her tiny hands wringing the edges of the blanket, her eyes focused on the floor. Lily had woken up a few minutes ago, her little face still pale, but her breathing had evened out. Her hand was wrapped around the golden locket, her fingers tightly clutching it as if the small piece of jewelry held the answer to everything. Thomas took a deep breath, the weight of the day pressing on his chest. He was preparing himself for what he knew was coming. Something much darker than the storm that had already swept through the town. They were not safe. And whoever the man in the black coat was, Thomas was certain that they would come again, sooner rather than later. The photograph had told him everything. It had connected the dots. The bad man. The ones who had been searching for these girls for days. And yet, there was still more. There was a thread buried so deep in the lies that it almost seemed impossible to pull. The photograph of the twins, the second shadow in the frame, and the note Emma had given him had shifted everything Thomas thought he knew. There was a larger game being played, and the twins, Emma and Lily, were at the center of it. The question now was how to untangle that web of deceit. The unexpected visitor. As Thomas stood by the window, waiting for the storm to roll in again, the quiet of the house was interrupted by a car pulling into the driveway. He didn't flinch, didn't rush to the door. He simply stood still, rifle now resting beside him, his hand instinctively reaching for the bandage wrapped around his wrist. Old injuries, ones from a lifelong past, had a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times. This time, it wasn't the weather that made his skin crawl. It was the car, Slow, deliberate, its engine purring like a predator on the hunt. From the corner of his eye, Thomas could see the vehicle parked at the edge of the driveway. He didn't need to see who was behind the wheel. He knew. The door opened with the distinct sound of tires crunching against snow. Footsteps. A knock. Thomas exhaled slowly. The man was here. It was time. He grabbed the rifle, his fingers steady as he adjusted the bolt action. He had dealt with threats before, real threats. Not some broken, desperate man in a black coat, but something about this felt different. There was a darkness to the air, a sense that things had gone too far, too fast. Stepping into the living room, Thomas approached the door, his boots silent against the worn floorboards. The twins were huddled together, their eyes wide, waiting for his next move. The knock came again. Firm. Authoritative. This time, Thomas didn't hesitate. He opened the door wide, standing tall, rifle in hand. And there on the other side stood a familiar face, one Thomas hadn't expected. Officer Mark Reynolds. "Mr. Calloway," the officer said, his voice smooth but guarded. "We need to talk." Thomas's grip tightened around the rifle. Reynolds was a local cop, decent enough, but Thomas had never trusted him. "About what?" Thomas asked, his voice cold. "About the twins," Reynolds replied, his gaze flicking past Thomas to where the girls were sitting, their small bodies stiff with tension. "They need to come with me." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He took a step forward, blocking the officer's view of the inside. "They're not going anywhere," he growled. Reynolds raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here to take them, Calloway. Not yet. But this is official business. I have orders." Thomas narrowed his eyes. Reynolds wasn't alone. The shadows were too thick behind him. The sense of unease grew with each passing second. "I don't care about your orders," Thomas snapped. "Those girls have been through hell. They're staying here. You understand me?" Reynolds hesitated, his jaw tightening as he looked over his shoulder at the figure waiting in the shadows. The man in the black coat stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. It was him, the man who had been lurking in the background, the one Thomas had been preparing for. His heart skipped a beat, unraveling the lies. The man in the black coat spoke, his voice calm, like a predator testing the water before the kill. "You're a stubborn old man, Calloway." Thomas gritted his teeth, stepping even closer. "And you're making a big mistake." The man's smile was cold, unsettling. "I don't make mistakes." Behind him, Officer Reynolds shifted, his hand brushing against his holster, the weight of the situation hanging thick in the air. Thomas didn't move. The man's eyes flicked over to the twins. They were still huddled together on the couch, watching, waiting. Their tiny hands were clutching each other, their eyes wide with a fear Thomas couldn't fully understand. They had been running for so long, their innocence already shattered by something far more dangerous than the snowstorm outside. "You're hiding them, Mr. Calloway," the man said, his tone thick with accusation. "And it's only a matter of time before I find out where they belong." Thomas stood still, his body tensed. His breath was slow, even, but his heart was pounding. "We both know you're not just after these girls," Thomas said, his voice quieter now. "This isn't just about them, is it?" The man didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer, his boots crunching softly in the snow. Then he pulled a photograph from his pocket, a picture of the girls, identical to the one Thomas had seen earlier. But this time, there were other details, a blurry figure in the background, a location, a hospital. Thomas' stomach twisted. "Why don't you tell me who's really behind all of this?" Thomas said, his voice steady, but his hands clenched around the rifle. The man's eyes narrowed. "It's better if you don't ask questions you don't want the answers to, Calloway. You wouldn't like what you find." But Thomas didn't flinch, His grip tightened, the weight of his rifle grounding him in the moment. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice growing colder. "What do you want with them?" The man's expression hardened. "You should know better than to get involved in things you don't understand." And with that, everything shifted. It was no longer just about protecting the twins. It was no longer just about the man in the black coat. It was about a game, one that Thomas hadn't known he'd been playing until it was too late. He had to end it. He had to break the web of lies before it consumed them all. The calm before the storm. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the door slammed open. But this time, it wasn't the man in the black coat. It wasn't Officer Reynolds. It was her. The woman who had left the twins in the snow. The one who had disappeared without a trace. The woman who had been behind everything. The twins' mother. A mother's return. The door crashed open with a force that rattled the windows, and the chill of the outside air rushed in, cutting through the warmth of the house. Thomas's pulse quickened as he spun toward the sound, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands. At first, he thought it was another threat, another figure in the shadows. But then, standing in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the dying daylight, was a woman. She was tall, her face pale from the cold, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Her long, tangled hair hung in messy waves around her shoulders, and her coat, though thick, was weathered and torn from wear. But it was her eyes that caught Thomas off guard. The same eyes that haunted his memories, the same look that had been etched in his daughter's face before she had vanished. Her face was familiar. The woman took a step forward, her breath coming in shaky bursts. "You need to let me explain," she said, her voice tight with desperation. Thomas's hand tightened on the rifle. He took a single step toward her, his body rigid with caution. "Explain," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "You left those girls alone in the snow. You left them to freeze. And now you walk back into my house like it's nothing." The woman's face paled further, her gaze flicking toward the twins who were still sitting quietly on the couch, wide-eyed, watching the scene unfold. They hadn't moved. They hadn't spoken. For a moment, everything in the room stood still. Then the woman's shoulders slumped. "I had no choice," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "You don't understand. You don't know what's happening." "I know enough," Thomas growled, his voice rising. "I know that you abandoned them, and I know that whatever you're running from is about to come back and finish what it started." The woman flinched at his words, and for a split second, Thomas saw the shadows of guilt and fear cross her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but Thomas wasn't interested in excuses. He took a step closer. "If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you drag those girls back into whatever nightmare you've been running from, you've got another thing coming." But she didn't back down. Instead, she took a trembling step forward, her gaze locking with his. "You don't know what they're capable of. What he is capable of." Thomas's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let his expression betray him. "Who?" he demanded. "Who's after you? And why are you bringing this to my doorstep?" The woman hesitated, her breath shallow. "I never wanted to be part of this, but the moment I became involved, there was no going back. It's a family legacy. A curse. And I've spent the last 3 years trying to protect them." "Protect them?" Thomas's voice cracked with incredulity. "By abandoning them in the snow, by leaving them alone to fend for themselves in the middle of a blizzard. Tell me how that's protection." Her hand shook as she reached for the doorframe, steadying herself. "You think I wanted to do that?" she whispered, a hint of raw emotion breaking through. "I had no choice, Thomas. If I didn't, he would have found us all, and I couldn't risk him finding them." Thomas froze. The name hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. His chest tightened. He knew the name. It had been whispered in the darkest corners of his past. But he had never thought it would resurface. Not like this. "I know who you're talking about," Thomas said, his voice colder now. "But I don't understand. I thought we left that life behind." She shook her head, her voice breaking. We never left it behind. It's been following us for years. The story she could no longer hide. The wind howled through the cracks in the doorframe, carrying with it the faint scent of something ancient and unyielding. The woman took another step inside, her eyes never leaving the twins. I didn't think I would make it back to them, she said softly, as if speaking to herself. But here I am. Thomas's grip on the rifle loosened, though he didn't put it down. He didn't trust her. Not yet. Not when the pieces of the puzzle were still scattered and incomplete. You're not going anywhere near them, he said, the words cold, final. Explain yourself, or get out. She nodded, slowly, her hands trembling as she reached up to touch her neck. Her fingers brushed over the same locket that Lily had been holding tightly all night. Her fingers lingered there for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was raw, broken. I never wanted them to be part of this. Her words hung in the air, each one dripping with pain. But you're right. I left them. I ran. She lowered her gaze to the floor, her voice trembling. They were born into this mess, and I couldn't keep them safe anymore. The only way to keep them alive was to keep them hidden, and that meant I had to leave. Thomas's mind raced, trying to connect the dots, trying to make sense of her confession. The weight of it was suffocating, the depth of her words more than just a simple explanation. It was a life Thomas had never known, one filled with secrets, lies, and a darkness he had assumed was behind him. The man chasing you, Thomas said, his voice like gravel. Who is he? Why is he after your daughters? She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. He's not just any man. He's a hunter, a tracker. His name is Elias Drake. He's part of something older than you or I, something twisted. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Elias Drake. The name hit him like a punch, a ghost from his past. The stories he had heard in whispers all those years ago had never seemed real, until now. He's after them because they're his, she continued, her voice trembling. They have his blood in their veins. And for years, I've been trying to keep them away from him, to keep them safe. Thomas shook his head, his pulse thundering in his ears. What does that mean? They're his. The woman nodded, her gaze fixed on the twins. Yes, he's their father. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Thomas's head spun with the implications, his heart sinking into his stomach. The man in the black coat, the hunter, Elias Drake. And now, standing in front of him, was the woman who had given birth to two girls whose lives were already written in the blood of the past. His gaze shifted to the twins, who were still sitting silently on the couch, their eyes wide and unblinking. They had heard it all. The fear and the tension in the room weighed heavily on their small shoulders. Thomas exhaled slowly. There was no turning back now. A choice that could change everything. The storm outside had stopped, but the tension inside was just beginning to build. The woman, who had been silent for so long, finally spoke again. I know you have questions. I know you're angry. But if you care about those girls, if you want them to be safe, we need to leave. Now, Elias Drake won't stop until he finds them. Thomas's heart beat in his chest like a drum. Where would we go? The woman's eyes were sharp, filled with a fierce determination. Anywhere but here. We need to disappear. We need to get them out of his reach. Thomas's mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't asked for this. But now, in front of him, stood a mother trying to protect her children, and a storm that was about to get worse. The question was no longer whether he could protect them. The question was whether he was willing to sacrifice everything to make sure they survived. As the fire crackled behind him, Thomas turned toward the woman, his resolve hardening. We leave at dawn, he said, his voice steady, unwavering.